In this chapter, we are going to be talking about communication in our relationships. Now, we're not going to dive too deeply into the specific relationships in this section of the chapter, but we are going to talk about relationships in general, some of the foundations of our relationships, the stages of relational interaction, which include coming together and coming apart, and finally, we are going to talk about the social exchange theory. So let's first talk about some of the foundations of our relationships in our lives. As we know, interpersonal relationships have a really important place in human life. We have to look at how we come to form relationships with our friends, our families, our romantic partners, and our coworkers. And sometimes we might find ourselves asking why some of these relationships are really exciting, where others are really stressful. Why some of these relationships are long-term and enduring, where others are much more short-lived. And our relationships exist in a lot of different states of being. One type of relationship that we can have is the personal relationship. Our personal relationships meet our emotional, relational, and instrumental needs. And these are typically very close, intimate, and interdependent relationships. So when we're talking about personal relationships, we are talking mostly about our best friends, our romantic partners, and our immediate family, those really intimate and close relationships that we have in our lives. In addition to personal relationships, however, we can also have social relationships. These social relationships occasionally meet our emotional, relational, and instrumental needs, but they lack the closeness and interdependence of our personal relationships. So we can think of social relationships to include people like our coworkers, our distant relatives, and our acquaintances. Now, the interesting thing about both personal and social relationships is that they can be either voluntary or involuntary. For example, with personal relationships, an example of a voluntary personal relationship is the relationship that you might have with your best friend or with your romantic partner. You chose to get into a relationship with those individuals. Whereas an example of an involuntary personal relationship would be the relationship that you have with your siblings or with your parents. Those are involuntary because you didn't choose to have those people in your lives necessarily. And in our social relationships, we might have voluntary relationships in the form of our acquaintances, whereas more involuntary relationships may include our neighbors and our distant relatives. It's also important to note that these relationships exist on a spectrum of sorts, from being very personal and very intimate to more impersonal and less intimate. And the direction that the relationship is going to go in, whether it's more personal or more impersonal, is going to depend ultimately on how close you are with that individual and how much self-disclosure is happening in that relationship. So overall, these are some of the foundations of the relationships that we have in our lives. And these interpersonal relationships, whether they are personal or just social, are all really important parts of our interpersonal lives.